Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much, Seamus. It's an honour to be asked to talk to the conference, but it's nice to be able to take the minister's place, you know. Basically, this is fairly simple. C stands for cow, but C stands for a lot of the critical criteria for success that we're going to address today. Like the first thing is confidence, and if you have the ability to drive on, you need the confidence and the courage to do so, and like a rising tide will lift all boats. There's a lot expected from farmers in the agri-food sector. It's the one indigenous industry that we have in Ireland that's actually capable of making a contribution to the recovery. So, you know, there's a lot of people hurting as a result of the economic climate that we're in, but you're not doing a disservice to the people that are hurting if you're fit to drive on, because a rising tide will lift all boats. And but we're in a global competition, so we've got to be competitive, and we've got to be slick, and we've got to be efficient. And we've got to be a lot more creative about how we market the product and how we position Ireland on the global stage. People talk about the green image of Ireland, but it's not a green image. It's actually a green reality, because you just have to go out the road a half a mile and you'll see the green fields. There are other countries where it is an image, but we talk about it as an image, but it isn't an image. It's a reality, and that differentiates us from our competitors. Collaboration and cooperation. We do fragmentation very, very well in Ireland. But the whole idea of farmers and processors cooperating together, and processors cooperating with each other in the global competition. Regulators and red tape and producers, all that. We need a lot more cooperation and collaboration if we're going to be successful in the global competition. Compliance with standards and rules and regulations are key, because they're there to protect us, and that's the area I'm going to address. And the final one that I see is credit, and that if you're going to expand, you need credit, and giving credit, and like someone's probably talk about the Italian mafiosa and the wheelings, you know. So credit is a big issue for us all. The future's looking good, provided we can avoid adverse publicity, and there's no better time to be a dairy farmer. Or any kind of a farmer, because whatever people give up in a recession, they can't give up eating, and it's better to be a farmer than a builder or a banker at the moment, okay? But these are the three things where I think that we actually stand to the wheels could come off the wagon. Big food safety scare, animal welfare issues, this creeping up there the whole time, the animal welfare issue, and nutrition and health. Like we say, when quotas go, we're going to drive on and increase the production, but there has to be demand for the production. And if the perception was that dairy products are clogging up your arteries, and I'll just give you a few examples. The boardroom table, at many boardroom tables of food companies, the discussion is about foreign exchange fluctuations, turbulence in the capital markets, the next merger and acquisition that's going to deliver double-digit growth. And if you were a spy listening in from outside, you'd wonder, what is this company about? Pensions, chief executive retention schemes, all those sort of things. Whereas often food safety, animal welfare and nutrition and health don't get onto the agenda unless there's an issue. I mean, it's a big issue on the Fonterra agenda now, but often these don't get discussed with the same depth as the risk management of financial risks. Food safety is not a gamble. It's a core function of the company leaders, and responsibility of food safety has to come from the very top because of the consequence of things going wrong. And this is just a recent false alarm. It was a false result in Fonterra, but basically they had to recall 38 tons of whey protein from 7 countries, and there's a huge law case with Danone versus themselves. They damaged huge confidence in, this is just to give you an idea of the shareholder funds. Look at that slump. I mean, that's what it can do to your company. Nobody wants to be associated with a food scare, and brands and reputations that takes years to build can actually come down overnight with a food scare. This is something that used to exist. Now they can barcode the bugs coming out of the sick people, right? So they can barcode the bug coming out of a patient and track it back to the food that the patient ate, to the retailer counting outlet, through the processors, all the way to the farms and the mills. And basically the hospital laboratories are all linked together now, and these barcodes go to a central database in Sweden, and so therefore heretofore if you ship contaminated product out of Ireland, they never come back to you. But now if they notice a particular bug occurring in a few places together, they can link them all together and trace them back. So this is something that you have to be vigilant about. Conventional microbiology, before the conventional labs were actually taking 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 days to get a result. But now with just-in-time delivery, ingredients arrive, they're incorporated into finished product, they're on the shelves, everything is fast moving, and there isn't 7 or 8 days to wait for a result. So there are more modern techniques that we have to use to get the results much faster. Increasing ability of the analytical chemists. There was a time we could detect chemicals and taint in milk at 1 part per million, then it went to 1 part per billion. Like 1 part per billion is able to find one man in China. Now it's 1 part per trillion. So basically, we can get down to lower and lower levels. So there's no doubt about it that we're going to see more and more chemical-related scares. And they're able to fingerprint the chemicals like they can barcode the bugs, and they can track that chemical back to you. In 2008, we had a global recall of Irish pork, and this was a spectacular own goal for us in Ireland. And this is just some headings from the internet. But like, it's interesting that we were in the head of the China Daily. That was in the middle of their melamine crisis. They were covering our pork crisis. So, like, if we had put some of that bread meal into Keenan feeders and fed it to dairy cows, and we had to recall infant formula, or we had to recall Bailey's, or if we had to recall Kerrygold, we wouldn't be having this meeting now. That would have been, and that was a close call. That could have happened. That could have happened. But we have to learn the lessons from that. But in Ireland, we're not good at learning the lessons. We just forget them and move on. We're kind of positive. We're looking to the future. But you have to learn. It's a fool that doesn't learn from his own mistakes. This is a thing that's just cutting out of the Farmers Journal from this week, you know. Like, we're over quota 1% or 1.1% or whatever, and there's a shift of milk to the north. And so basically, there's milk moving from the south to the north. It's moving in containers that are not food grade. I mean, this is a recipe for another scare. I mean, the guys that are at this, I mean, along the border, there's people and they couldn't do the right thing. It's not in their nature. Like my father comes from Cavan, and there they used to say that 100 yards of the border has the same earning capacity as 500 acres of land. So, like, if you want to have a pint, these lads are great fellas to have a pint with, but these are the same lads that wreck the industry. And so we have to cull the dodgy operators from the herd, and someone's selling the milk and someone's buying the milk. And so basically, all we have is a chemical taint in some container that God only knows what could have been in it. Washed diesel, for all I know, before the milk went into it. But traceability, to pull that back down to us and the wheels will come off. You just don't want a scare. Like, the tolerance level for chemicals in infant formula is less than 10 parts per billion for pesticides. So that level is, like, the testers are like people that are testing Olympic athletes. So we can't have a scare. So somebody's selling the milk and somebody's buying the milk, and that has to be stopped. Short-term gain, like, greed is a good motivator, but it'll take the wheels off. On the farm level, like, myself and Jack Kennedy and David Gleeson from Chagas were judging the Milk Quality Awards, and the standards of our top guys, I mean, they're unbelievable. This was one of the parlours. The bars in this parlour were like the towels in the rails in the hotel where you hang the towels. You'd just wonder how 120 cows went through that an hour before we arrived and kept it so clean. So guys are demonstrating what we can do in Ireland, and the pride and the passion that we have in Ireland is special. And so when one fella can do it right, everybody can do it right. The food chain, we've naively convinced the consumer that the food chain is a straight line, farm to fork. I mean, if we all got €1 for every time we heard farm to fork, we'd be all in the Barbados now. We wouldn't be here. But the food chain is a lot more complex than this. And so it's not simple to trace things from the farm to the consumer. And if you start trying to trace whey proteins or milk or even the ingredients of cheese, it's not simple to go right back to the farm. So this is what the food chain is really like, you know. And it's more of a maze. And so if there's a problem in there, it's difficult to trace it back. So prevention has to be the effort rather than crisis management when things go wrong. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, and you'd say, there's a field out there full of round bales and there's a needle in one of them. Can you find it for me? Because I don't want the cow choking and eating it. Well, you'd say, well, geez, you haven't a rat's chance. Well, you have. And this is exactly the way it works with the food industry, because whenever we have to do a recall, I'll stop the cows getting choked because I'll recall all the bales and destroy them all. And that's what happens. Whenever there's a food scare, we can't do a precise recall. And so tons and tons of unimplicated product has to be recalled, and it costs a small fortune. So the emphasis has to be on prevention. Safe feed is essential. A lot of the big scares that we're seeing is related to feed. A lot of it is related to feed, and so this is where we really need to pay attention to detail. And we're globally sourcing feed. And so basically, the health of our sector is often dependent on controls and operation in another jurisdiction completely. And we say, you hear people talking about dodgy foreign imports and China. Like all of the vitamins and minerals that are currently being used in animal rations in the EU are coming from China. So if they get that wrong, we're all stumped. This is actually, we had a scare about 2 years ago with palm kernel contaminated with arsenic. And basically, it wasn't actually a deliberate contamination. The soil is contaminated because of volcanic ash. So if the palm is grown in that soil, you get palm kernel with over the legal limit of arsenic in it, which would be dynamite if it was in baby food. And the ship that shipped that came from Malaysia, but they loaded the ship in 3 different ports. This just shows you how complicated this whole thing is. Cargill loaded that ship in 3 different ports. So taking a sample from the ship and saying the ship was okay. This is the sort of thing here, a typical ship. And you go down to the port, how many 25-gram samples are you going to take to deem this shipment safe? So the whole challenge is for risk-based sampling, and so you can't ignore feed. And basically, you have to be confident that the people who made the feed in the first instance did it right, good process controls, and the sampling needs to be done at loading, because you can't sample when it's all mixed together. And composite samples, we're now using what because the chemists are so sensitive now, you could group 100 samples together, and one test, if you got a positive, then you could break it up into the 100, you know. Increasingly, we're using byproducts from biorefineries, and distillers' dried grains aren't the same as brewers' grains. Brewers' grains, brewing is a food grade business, whereas this distilling isn't. It's a different culture, and often you get harmful residues. And again, chemicals, low levels, big issue for us. Byproducts of oil, we've had a lot of waste oil recycling, and there's a lot of scares. That a big scare in Germany linked to dioxin contaminated oil. The culture of collecting waste, this is waste food grade oil, is quite different. Like people that are in the waste business, you couldn't compare them to a dairy farmer. It's a different culture. Recycled human food, we saw that with the bread in our own dioxin scare, but increasingly out of spec human food is actually being recycled as animal feed. And 40% of the food is being wasted. They say there's enough food wasted in the UK to feed a country in Africa. So now there's a big drive on to try and recycle as much of this into animal rations. It's grand, provided it's not waste. You can't talk about waste human food, because if it's dumped, you can't. If it's dumped, it's dumped. You can't dump it and then bring it back into the food chain. If it's going to actually be human food or animal feed, it has to stay in the controlled chain. So it has to be properly handled. Different culture again for managing waste. Sludge, residues on farms. Pick up residues in the milk. On-farm mixing. We talk about on-farm mixing, but some farms, and especially now if we're going to really grow for those big dairy herds, they'll be like the pig herds. We'll be having on-farm mills, which are a different scale. Feed quality assurance systems. There's a whole range of systems, and basically the legal limit is like the pass level in the exam. When you're on the private standards, you're on the honours paper. It gives you a little bit of extra, and this is what we should be striving for to protect the sector. Basically, most of our processors use other stuff as well as milk, and so therefore there's no point in having Rolls-Royce controls on one part of your ingredients if some of the rest of the stuff isn't. Like a few years ago, some of our dairy co-ops who were making margarine brought in pomace olive oil from Spain that was contaminated with a polyaromatic hydrocarbon, and we were really lucky that we didn't have to do a massive recall on spreads. And so basically every single ingredient, if you say, I remember at that time I said to one of the guys in a well-known co-op, do you buy pomace olive oil from Spain? He says, Paddy, I don't know. I said, how do you mean you don't know? We buy it off a commodity trader in Rotterdam. So, I mean, that's suicidal stuff. And in that particular facility, I used to bring the students there. State of the art, you'd say this is a Rolls-Royce facility. But every ingredient any one of those ingredients could bring you down. And when you're on telly trying to explain to why you sold contaminated product, you can't say it wasn't us, it was one of our suppliers. You can't say that. You're responsible for your brand. So your brand is as secure as your weakest supplier. So basically the milk could be perfect, but something else that you're buying in. And often some of our co-ops, they have a whole portfolio of products. So once you have the brand on everything, all you have to have is one product, might be unrelated to dairy, going down. It'll damage the entire brand. Ask yourself one question every day. Would you trust your suppliers to pack your parachute and jump out of a plane? And that doesn't matter whether you're a farmer buying something off a fella in a white high-ace van or you're a co-op. If you wouldn't trust them to jump out of a plane, don't trust them with your brand. Who are your key staff? This is very, very crucial. Staff are our greatest asset, or also can be your greatest liability. And you saw the situation with Larry Goodman's operation, Silvercrest. A couple of the staff up there weren't paying attention to detail, and they did something that was wrong. They broke the product spec for the supermarkets. Now, there was 2 frauds. Tesco's and Burger King wanted grass-fed Irish beef. They were getting Polish beef trim, but the Polish then had their own fraud. So there was 2 frauds. But basically, your staff are key, and your key staff might be your cleaners. It's interesting to see the attention to detail that farmers pay to clean the milking parlour twice a day, and the ritual they go through. And often in some food processing facilities, the guys that are cleaning up the parlour are actually not nearly as diligent as the farmers. And so that's one thing that we have in Ireland that we don't capitalise on when I'm talking about being creative, is that the farmers in Ireland are actually milking the cows, and the pride and the passion they know, the knowledge that our farmers have is phenomenal. Whereas if you go to the big dairy farms in the US, the fella who owns it isn't there at all. He's in some office in New York, and the parlour's being cleaned by 2 illegal Mexicans, Jose and Jose B.